Hi, hello, and welcome back. Or if you are new here, welcome. My name is Heather, and here on Nice People, we talk about the kinds of things nice people don't talk about. About a month ago, I made a video officially coming out as someone with OSDD, which is a dissociative disorder that's very similar to DID. In fact, it's often referred to as a less severe form of DID. You guys asked some really great questions in the comment section of that video, and I'm going to attempt to answer those questions now. But first, a disclaimer. I am not a medical or mental health professional of any kind. I'm just a regular person who happens to have OSDD, and everything I'm about to say is based solely on my experience of the disorder. OSDD for me can look very different from OSDD in someone else. We might share the same core symptoms, but the degree to which we experience each of those symptoms can differ greatly. So just keep that in mind as I answer your questions, okay? Let's get into them. So let's see, this first one says, I love your content. Thank you. And am very curious about your Spravato treatments and whether it was impacted by OSDD or whether it ever caused you to shift into another part of you, for lack of a better term. That is a really great question. For those of you who don't know, I'm currently undergoing Spravato treatments for treatment-resistant depression, and the most common side effect of Spravato is dissociation. I've made videos about every one of my treatment experiences, and I'll have a link to that playlist in the description of this video if you want to check those out. To answer your questions, whether or not my OSDD has had an impact on my Spravato treatments, or if Spravato has ever caused me to switch into alternate states of identity, or alters. So far, I've done 22 Spravato treatments. And for the first 21 treatments, my OSDD didn't seem to have an effect on or be affected by Spravato. Like, my experiences during treatment don't seem to differ wildly from those of people who don't have dissociative disorders. Nor did I experience any kind of switching between alters. But this last treatment, number 22, little bit of a different story, but we'll get to that. First, I need to explain how I experience my alters. There's this big misconception that everyone with DID and OSDD switches into alters, and that they have no control over what they do or memory of what they did when an alter was fronting. That is true for some people with these disorders, but definitely not all. And it's not true for me. To try and explain this, I'm going to use the car metaphor. Picture yourself driving a car full of people. In this metaphor, the car is your body, and the person in the driver's seat is the one who is fronting or in control of the body. For some people, switching can be like getting kicked out of the driver's seat and put into one of the passenger seats. For others, switching it can be more like getting yanked out of the driver's seat and thrown into the trunk of the car, where you can't see or hear what's going on in the car, can't see where you're going or where you've been, and you certainly don't have control over the car. I think that's the kind of switching most people are familiar with. However, I don't get thrown into the trunk of the car. I mean, I have a few times, but it's nowhere near the norm for me. I am pretty much always in the driver's seat, but with some very loud and opinionated backseat drivers. At most, I might switch into the front passenger seat, where I can still see and hear everything that's going on. I'm just not quite in control of the car. Usually. So now to answer your question, Spravato doesn't kick me out of the driver's seat, and certainly not into the trunk of the car. But that is very specific to me. Someone else with DID or OSDD might have a totally different experience. They might immediately get thrown into the trunk of the car. I know you didn't ask this, but I'd imagine you're still curious about what the whole Spravato experience is like for me. When I'm not under the effects of Spravato, it's like I'm driving a car with some very loud, opinionated backseat drivers who don't always agree on what route we should be taking, or what we should be listening to on the radio, or what temperature the car should be, etc. When I am under the effects of Spravato, I'm more or less able to tune them out and have some very intense experiences of singularity. And that was very surprising to me because I thought for sure it was going to be a free-for-all while doing Spravato because it causes dissociation, which I definitely do experience during treatment, but it doesn't cause me to switch, as far as I can tell. I've never had the nurses or techs tell me that I said or did things during treatment that I have no memory of. I have no clue as to why I feel more grounded and singular during treatment, but I have one hypothesis. The things that typically cause me to dissociate to the point of either being kicked out of the driver's seat or, at the very least, render me a very distracted driver, the cause is some sort of external source or trigger. A person, a place, a song, a smell, a certain type of vehicle, a certain time of day, just regular, everyday things that I encounter in the external world. Hence why it is so disruptive for me. During treatment, I lose awareness of all of those things. It's like I'm in an alternate universe or some other world, and my alter activity seems to quiet down. Like I said, just a theory. Please, if any of you have more insight into this or experience it yourself, please let me know down in the comments. I'd also love to hear what your guys' theories are. So that's what treatment is usually like for me. Now let's talk about treatment number 22, because that one was totally different. If you haven't seen my video on it, I highly recommend checking it out. Basically, nothing that I'm used to experiencing happened, and I did seem to experience not quite a switch, but another alter being present. The best way I can describe it, using the car metaphor, is that it was like an alter just suddenly materialized in the driver's seat with me, like on my lap. And I could feel what they were feeling, which was incredibly confused and uncomfortable. And I could hear them saying things like, "What the f*** is going on? I shouldn't be here right now. This is not right." After what felt like a few minutes, they were gone. And it was back to just me again in the driver's seat, but experiencing some pretty intense derealization, which wasn't normal for me. And that's the only time that has happened during treatment. We'll have to see what happens at my next one, which is next week, actually. This next one is from Callie A. Hi, Callie. I would love to know how DID and OSDD reacts with Spravato. Do you find it connects you to your alters or inner world experience? Has it helped you with integrating parts or lost memories? Also, what was your first realization of an alter part? I know you mentioned your first moments of lost time, but when did you really connect with the alter of it all? Also, how many do you have, and do you have an inner world? Also great questions. Thank you, Callie. I'll just answer them in the order you asked them. First up, do you find it connects you to your alters or inner world experience? Not really. And I think I kind of answered this in the last question. Like, I don't really experience my alters at all during treatment. But I do have a story about connecting to my inner world. For those of you who aren't familiar with the DID or OSDD lingo, Inner or internal worlds refer to the common internal reality or landscape in which alters reside. Obviously, it's not a real place, but it can be a very useful and therapeutic tool for people with DID and OSDD. It's not that different from other therapies or practices that have you visualize a safe and inviting place. I think it was my week 6 video where I didn't share my experience and just said that it was a very personal experience for me. It was because I went into my inner world, and I wasn't talking about this stuff yet. During that treatment, I went into my inner world, which for me it's a house. Actually probably more like a castle. It's huge. So there has always been this one wing of the house that is totally inaccessible to me. It's dark, dilapidated, dangerous, just not meant to go there. During this treatment, I was able to kind of explore that wing of the house. Not really, but I was able to actually be there in the hallway. I didn't gain any insight into what's down there or what's being hidden from me, and that is the only time I've been able to do that. I've tried a couple more times, but it just didn't work out. I think it just came down to the fact that, in my experience, trying to curate or have a particular kind of experience during treatment is really hard and not very fruitful. It is much easier to just surrender and go along for the ride and trust that your brain knows what it needs. The first time I successfully went into my inner world, I went into it with a very, I don't know if this is gonna work, but let's see what happens. The 1 or 2 unsuccessful times after that, I was much more, let's go back to the hallway. Let's find out what's going on down there. I was trying to have a particular experience. Has it helped you with integrating parts or lost memories? No, but I haven't been trying to do anything like that either. So I don't know if it's possible. From what I understand, integrating parts is usually a very lengthy process, like years. What was your first realization of an alter part? I know you mentioned your first moments of lost time, but when did you really connect with the alter of it all? If I'm understanding you correctly, you're wondering when it all clicked with me, like when I first realized I have alters. I think that's what you're asking. I mentioned in other videos that I didn't know that I have OSDD until like 4 or 5 years ago, but there have been many, many signs for well over a decade. I wish I could recall a specific moment when it really registered for me that I have alters. Certainly seems like a memorable moment, right? I think for me, it was more of a gradual realization. Like, there was never a moment where I suddenly heard a voice in my head talking to me saying, "Hey, I'm one of your alters. I'm so-and-so." That didn't happen. If I remember correctly, my realization and acceptance of the fact that I have alters began, well, about 5 years ago after a very traumatic experience. I think the first thing that I noticed, but didn't connect at all to the traumatic event or even think it was a dissociative disorder, was that I had a very clear and enduring sense that there were at least 2 other people or entities within me. I could sense their presence clear as day, and I was terrified. I'm not even a religious person, but I thought I was possessed. Mind you, I wasn't familiar at all with dissociative disorders or DID or OSDD, so possession was the closest explanation I had for what was happening to me. I could sense these entities and what they were feeling, and some part of me knew that they could take over my body at any moment. Truly terrifying time. So that, along with a number of other symptoms, had been going on for about a year before I finally came across the Dissociative Experiences Scale, which is a screening tool for dissociative disorders, and realized, oh my God, I think I might have a dissociative disorder. And ultimately ended up with the therapist that I have now. He's great. We stan. Now, I don't know if I started talking to my alters prior to seeing him or after, but I know that I finally started talking to them, these entities that I could sense within me. By the way, fully thinking I was out of my mind and that there was no way this was real. But to my total shock and surprise, they responded. And it was very conversational, like nothing like constructing dialogue in my head. I'd ask a question, and with no thought at all as to what the answer might be, there'd be one. In a quote-unquote voice in my head that was definitely not me. But even after I had started talking to my alters, I would still have doubts as to whether or not it was real. Like, am I making this up? Do I have some other mental illness that's making me do this and not realize that I'm doing this to myself? But as time went on and I got to know them more and met others, whenever I'd have the thought, is this real? Am I just making this up? Their response would be, really? Really? We're doing this again? And I would feel their irritation with me. There was another time when I just decided I didn't want alters or OSDD. Nope, this isn't real. I've got something else and I've just been putting myself on this whole time. But, much to my dismay at the time, my alters didn't disappear. None of it disappeared. Now, after working with them for years, I just know. Yeah, they're real. This is real. This is what it is. As for how many alters I have, I wish I could tell you. I'm not sure I even know how many I have. I thought I was going to be able to disclose the number that I'm currently aware of, but for some reason, one or more of us is very uncomfortable with that. Not sure what that's about. We're going to have a chat about it. Maybe that's something I'll be able to share in the future. In Blue says, I have all the symptoms of OSDD, but they only started occurring recently, 37 years old, after a series of intense trauma. Never had symptoms before. I'm so confused. And by the way, do you happen to know anything about alter fusion and how it is supposed to happen? Are you working towards it? First of all, I can totally relate to your experience. I was 30 when I started experiencing symptoms out of nowhere, or seemingly out of nowhere. And it just so happens that DID and OSDD are most commonly diagnosed in women around age 30. It's also incredibly common to not have any awareness of it until later on in life, oftentimes following a traumatic or series of traumatic events. And you just start having all of these bizarre symptoms that seemingly come out of nowhere. Although, you seem to have connected those dots pretty quickly. I didn't. One reason for this has to do with what DID and OSDD really are. an incredibly adaptive and sophisticated survival strategy that your brain can employ to protect you from the awareness of or the devastating effects of usually severe childhood trauma. So by its very nature, you're not supposed to know that you have DID or OSDD. As long as your system is working correctly, you're not going to know you have it. What oftentimes, but not always, ends up happening is that later on in your adult life, something happens. A traumatic or series of traumatic events, the death of a perpetrator, or maybe you have kids who are now the age that you were when your childhood trauma occurred. And now suddenly, you're experiencing all of these symptoms of DID and OSDD that you never have before, which is exactly what happened to me. Now, this is just kind of one way that people can come to discover that they have DID or OSDD. For some people, there isn't some kind of traumatic catalyst that unearths it. They might have just reached a safe and stable point in their life, and their brain decides, oh, okay, cool. I think it's time to start dealing with this stuff. If you suspect that you have DID or OSDD, I highly recommend you seek out a therapist, and ideally one who is at least familiar with dissociative disorders, because it is very commonly misdiagnosed. As for alter fusion or integration, I'll be honest, I don't really know how it works. It's not something I'm currently working toward, though I likely will in the future. I know it can take a long time and can be a difficult but worthwhile process. Jess from Multiplicity and Me has a few great videos about it, which I highly recommend checking out, including one about her own experience with alter fusion. I'll put links to them in the description of this video. Well, this was fun. Thanks again for all of your questions, and by all means, if you have more, please put them in the comment section of this video, and I'll do my best to answer them. If you liked this video or found it helpful in any way, please consider liking it. It helps me out a lot. And if you'd like to join us in being one of the nice people who talk about things like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel before you go. I hope you guys have a wonderful week, and I'll be seeing you next week. Bye.